You're listening to Decolonisation, a podcast series that explores how Ukraine and Eastern Europe are perceived globally and why countering Russian imperial influence is crucial for the future of global democracy. The podcast is created by Ukrainier International, and I'm your host, Anastasiia Marushevska. Our guest today is Timothy Garton Ash, a distinguished British historian, author, and commentator. He's well known for his extensive writings on modern European history, particularly regarding Central and Eastern Europe. He's a professor of European Studies at the University of Oxford, Isaiah Berlin Professional Fellow at St. Anthony's College, and a Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University. His work is characterized by his first-hand experiences and direct involvement in the events he describes, making him a pivotal figure in contemporary historical and political analysis related to Europe. His recent book, Homelands, A Personal History of Europe, reflects political transformation from the mid-20th century to the present and tells a unique history of Europe, the one that includes its center and east, including Ukraine. Thank you, Timothy, so much for joining us today.
Pleasure to be with you.
I would like to actually start the conversation with your book, Homelands, A Personal History of Europe, where you combine historical analysis with personal experiences of major events from the mid-20th century into the present. Can you share a little bit how did you determine which events were the most significant to include in the book?
Sure. Great to be with you. So that book took me just 50 years to write, 50 years of traveling around Europe, observing great events, meeting interesting people, studying Europe in more conventional ways, writing it all down in notebooks. And it's a personal history of Europe. So it's a rather unusual genre. It's history illustrated by memoir and reportage. So there are the twin criteria. On the one hand, it's the interesting things that I myself have seen and heard over the last 50 years. On the other hand, it's the things that were really important and consequential for Europe, for the history of Europe. And best of all, when those two things meet. So, for example, I described meeting Vladimir Putin when he was still a totally unknown deputy mayor of St. Petersburg in 1994. And he's already talking about territories which he says, I quote, were always Russian, but are now outside the Russian Federation. And he specifically mentions Crimea. And he says there are 25 million Russians outside the Russian Federation, and we have a duty to look after them. So that's a personal anecdote, but it also obviously has immense historical implications because it's a very early example of the basic revanchist instinct that's clearly driven Putin ever since to try and win back the Russian Empire. And in terms of the pattern of the book, basically I identified two overlapping periods. The post-war period, 1945 on, obviously, but then what I call the post-wall period, the period since the fall of the Berlin Wall. And what I argue in the book is that the post-wall period, which starts, obviously, with the fall of the Berlin Wall on the 9th of November 1989, actually ends on the 24th of February 2022 with Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
You notably start your book about your father and his participation in D-Day and finish somehow with full-scale war against Ukraine. Was it specifically you've chosen this kind of the beginning and the end as some kind of metaphor, or it has like direct connection for you?
So it's a really interesting question. So look, it was kind of obvious to me that I had to get back to 1945. You can't understand the history of today's Europe without going back to the Second World War. But rather, obviously, I wasn't there. I was minus 10 years old. But my father was. He landed with the first wave on D-Day in the Normandy invasion and fought all his way through to Germany. So I get back to 1945 through his experience. So going back to these places where he landed in Normandy, the French village, the German village he occupied, when the Western Allied forces had reached northern Germany. But listen, when I started writing the book about 5 or 6 years ago, obviously the full-scale war had not yet happened. So I had a very strong sense that things were going badly wrong in Europe. I mean, that was absolutely clear. We'd already had 2014. We had the migration crisis. We had COVID. We had Brexit. We had all sorts of things were going wrong. But I didn't know there was going to be the largest war in Europe since 1945. But as I worked on the book, this happened. And I started coming again to Ukraine after the full-scale invasion. And it became absolutely self-evident that the story has to be bookended by the Second World War at the beginning and the largest war in Europe since the Second World War at the end.
For me, in general, was very hard for many years to read books about Central and Eastern Europe, and specifically about Ukraine, by the historians outside of the region. And, there was always something profoundly wrong in the way Ukraine was portrayed. And your book is, I would say, genuinely is very different, because it shows this picture of Europe as a whole and recognizing common history across many countries, including Poland, Hungary, Ukraine, and up to the border with Russia. And why did you decide to give European history this broader perspective, which might sound obvious, but at the same time, it's actually rarely articulated this way?
Yeah, it's a great point. And listen, there are two reasons. One is personal and one is historiographical and political. The personal reason is that Central and Eastern Europe gave me the formative political experiences of my life. I started traveling in East Germany, living in East Germany, spied on by the Stasi. Then my first book in English was about the Solidarność movement in Poland in 1980-81. Then I got to know the great Central East European dissidents like Václav Havel or Adam Michnik and others, and chronicled the whole emancipation and liberation of East Central Europe initially, and then beyond to the Baltic states and Ukraine and others, 1989 to 1991. So it's absolutely central to my life, but it's also actually central to understanding Europe. And I would say that this book is part of a process. Let me talk first of all just about Europe in general, and then we'll come to Ukraine, of rediscovering that, if you like, equal importance, that balance between Western and Eastern Europe in our understanding of the continent. So Norman Davies, for example, writes a book called Europe, a History, published in the mid-1990s, where for the first time, to my knowledge, Eastern and Western Europe are given roughly equal weight, but they're not really integrated. Tony Judt, in his book, Post-War, makes a next step to try to integrate them. And I think I try to take the next step in which they are self-evidently interwoven. Because at the end of the day, quite honestly, I think we want to get beyond all these simplistic categories: Western Europe, Southern Europe, Northern Europe, Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Southeastern Europe. We can go on and just say, actually, there's one Europe in all its complexity and diversity, but also in its deeper unity.
Yeah, there is a lot of conversation about who is Central Europe, who is Eastern Europe, and it's I'm always confused based on what do we specify these.
Well, I mean, the centre keeps moving. It's a movable feast, isn't it? But what I would say is that it's quite useful for people to see Ukraine as Central Europe, because that already is a psychological shift. And what Central Europe was, and the idea of Central Europe in the 1980s and 1990s, was a kind of ferry, like a ferry that goes from one bank of a river to the other. And it was a ferry on which countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary went from the political East to the political West. And of course, that's now what's happening with Ukraine. So it's a pretty good ferry to be on, even if the definition is quite elusive.
Yeah, and in your book, as you mentioned before, you talk a lot about former Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, East Germany during the communist period, and you have a lot of professional and personal experiences in these places. What do you think the rest of the world, who might not be that well aware of this historical period, what the life was in these countries before they freed themselves from communism?
So I think, first of all, for knowing something about it, because, throughout the Cold War, people in the West lived with their backs to the Iron Curtain, with their backs to the Berlin Wall. It was as if Siberia began at Checkpoint Charlie, right? And so they knew very little about them. So knowing more about where other European countries come from is valuable in itself. But beyond that, I would say they help you, the experience of these countries helps you to understand how the devil plays many tunes, if you like, how subtle in some ways and insidious can be the mechanisms with which dictatorships keep control of their people. Because unlike the situation now where everyone can see that, Ukraine is under constant bombardment from missiles and bombs and drones, it wasn't at first glance obvious that you were living in a totalitarian or post-totalitarian dictatorship, but the mechanisms of control through things like the Stasi secret police were very subtle, but equally effective. So I think, understanding how dictatorships exploit human weaknesses and also understanding how it can happen to anyone.
Yeah, I think in your book, a very good example of these differences between the West and the East, somehow, central part of Europe, during the same period of time, because I think you make these great parallels of what was happening in both regions at the same time. And this is a generation of 68ers, and across Europe, from the West, Germany to France, there were a lot of kind of revolutions, and they championed ideas like anti-colonialism, sexual revolution, but they were often ideologically tied to communism. Meanwhile, at the same time, people in Poland, for example, were protesting against real-life communism. Why do you think in the late 60s, even despite well-known atrocities of the USSR at that point, these communist ideas remained so popular in the West?
Well, first of all, I think 68 is probably the most significant date between 1945 and 1989. And, in Prague during the Velvet Revolution in 1989, as I recall in the book, there were hand-painted posters which showed 89 as 68 upside down, right? Because if you just rotate it through 180 degrees, you go from 68 to 89. And what I would say, I think is important, is that generation, the 68ers, the 68, the 68er, actually had quite a lot in common. Sort of anti-authoritarian attitudes, an interest in equality, in emancipation. Danny Cohn-Bendit, who was one of the great figures of 68, said on one of the anniversaries of 68, we succeeded socially and culturally, and thank heaven, we failed politically. And I think that's true. So the social and cultural transformation was common, right? Across, and a Ukrainian 68er and a Polish 68er have something in common with the Spanish and Polish one. But the politics were completely different. My friends, the 68ers in Central and Eastern Europe, wanted what we in the West already had. Social democracy, liberal democracy, some version of Western liberal democracy. The 68ers in Western Europe were still clinging to ideals of socialism understood as a utopian system, having not necessarily simply the Soviet system, but having a great deal in common with real existing socialism. And the result is there was a total dialogue of the deaf between Paris and Prague, right? So when Adam Michnik goes to Paris, there's a complete incomprehension of his political position. And similarly, when some of the West German 68ers go to Prague or Warsaw, there's total incomprehension because they're talking the language of the dictatorship. Fortunately, by 89, we'd got beyond that.
Yeah, this actually made me smile when I was reading your book, and there was this phrase that fortunately the political ideas in the West of the 68ers failed. Yeah, so we should be lucky. Should be happy.
And unfortunately they failed in the East because, of course, you know, 89 would have happened in 68 if, you know, because we have to remember that Dubček's idea of socialism with a human face had at least the potential for further evolution, and that would have spared a large part of the region, not necessarily the Soviet Union, you know, another 20 pretty grim years.
Yeah, and you know, I didn't think about it straight ahead, but after a while, I understood that the Ukrainian generation from the 60s, called 60 years, or шестидесятники in Ukrainian, it's a slightly different story in different circumstances, but still it was almost at the same time. And it's a generation of Ukrainian intelligentsia who revived national cultural ideas of Ukraine. And it's interesting whether Ukrainian 60ers are a part of the discussion in the Western academia when talking about the 60s in general and kind of the transformations of the 60s.
Yeah, it's a great question. And the answer is that I have a shelf load of books on 68 and it features hardly at all. So alas, that's still part of this sort of Western condescension towards the East. But, you know, my good friend Yaroslav Hrtsak, the very fine Ukrainian historian, who I think would be representative of that generation, is recognizably a 68er in many ways in sort of social and cultural attitudes, but at the same time, the agenda, which is one of national cultural and political revival, is a very different one. And in that sense, I would say the Ukrainian 68 had more in common with 1848, because the point about 1848 is that liberalism and nationalism walked together. And that was a very strange idea to Western liberals in the 1990s or 2000s. It's, I think one of the things that Ukraine has actually given us.
The circumstances under which kind of Central Europe and Ukraine were existing at that point were quite different still. For example, now when I was reading your book and when I was reading works, for example, by Slavenka Drakulic from Croatia and I couldn't help but thinking about the life in Ukraine and the Soviet occupation. And for example, in Cafe Europa, Drakulic mentions how people from former Yugoslavia were traveling to the Western Europe and were kind of perceived differently and mistrusted. But I was thinking that Ukrainians could not go anywhere and they were living kind of in a state of near total lockdown. Do you think that these differences, even though both regimes were terrible, authoritarian, with a lot of, oppression of intelligentsia and freedom, but there are still differences in the way, for example, people from Croatia or Poland are perceived in Western Europe and people from Ukraine? Is there kind of more understanding of Central Europe in comparison to Ukraine?
Well, look.
No.
there is still a lot of what I call intra-European orientalism, a tendency still in the West, in Western Europe, in countries like France and Spain in particular, but also elsewhere, to regard the whole of Eastern Europe, quote unquote, as somehow vaguely backward, slightly exotic, inclined to authoritarianism, marginally barbaric, not wholly European. I mean, there's a man called Gonzague de Reynaud who famously talked about Western Europe as the European Europe, with the ridiculous implication that the rest of Europe is somehow not European. So those prejudices, which go all the way back to the Enlightenment, are still there. But what has changed them has been the agency of the peoples of Central and Eastern Europe themselves in crisis. So what's a crucial turning point for Czechoslovakia? It's 1968. This is suddenly when people start reading a lot of Czech literature. They're reading Klima and Kundera and Havel and Škvorecký and taking it more seriously as part of the European conversation. Poland, 80-81. The whole region, 1989. Then, of course, you mentioned Slavenka Drakulic. When did she start being more widely read? Well, of course, during and after the wars in former Yugoslavia. Now, in the case of Ukraine, I would say you've done the most dramatic catching up, which came in stages, right? So starts a bit in 1991. My first great experience of Ukraine was the Orange Revolution, 2004, 2005. I've never been so cold in my life as in Kiev in December 2004.
Oh, yeah. We like revolutions in winter,
That's right. So that already sort of starts putting Ukraine more on the map of European consciousness. Then, of course, Euromaidan 2014, but of course, crucially 2022. And now I would say there is, for the first time in modern history, absolutely for the first time in modern history, no doubt in most European minds that Ukraine is as much part of Europe as Croatia is, or Norway is, or Ireland is. It doesn't, unfortunately, follow from that you then get so easily into the EU or NATO, right? Because, if you think about the Western Balkans, North Macedonia has been a candidate for EU membership since 2005, right? Mm. So, there's a real sort of Balkan danger for Ukraine that you get stuck in this waiting room, in this, interim state, in this kind of limbo, what in German they call Zwischeneuropa, for a long, long time, so that the cultural recognition doesn't automatically lead to the full political recognition.
You mentioned few names, and I was also thinking about it. For example, Kundera and his kidnapped West, and Czesław Milosz, and many others were already explaining these Russian influence, like imperial influence over the region. In your opinion, who were the voices throughout the 20th century and 21st century who kind of managed to add Eastern and Central Europe to the general political and cultural agenda?
Oh, there are many.
Both, I would say, in East and West. I mean, I think that sort of we who come from Western Europe, I mentioned Norman Davies, my former student, Timothy Snyder, Anne Applebaum and others on our side were part of that conversation. But for example, Czesław Miłosz in Poland, Václav Havel, self-evidently, from Czechoslovakia and then the Czech Republic, Georgi Konrad, obviously. And now I think, you have a whole slew of Ukrainian intellectuals who are engaged in that exercise of explaining and connecting.
But when, for example, we look at Eastern European or like Slavic studies in different universities in Europe, how would you evaluate them? Because we often see that there are still a lot of Russian kind of present there, Russian influence, and you as a person of academia, how do you evaluate this from your point of view?
So this is a big problem because specifically in universities, there's a tremendous force of inertia or time lag, so that to this day, a lot of the academic studies are structured around something called Russian and East European studies, right? Which is a legacy of the Cold War, but also reflects these older stereotypes of sort of intra-European Orientalism. We've moved a long way from that at Oxford, I'm glad to say. Our European Studies Centre now studies the whole of Europe and Europe as a whole, but specifically in relation to Ukraine, it's still a persistent problem. I like to say that, having our studies of Europe structured so that you have Russian and East European studies 35 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall is rather as if, you would be doing German and East European studies in the 1970s or Ottoman and South European studies in the late 1930s. I mean, the time lag is extraordinary. It is changing, but slowly, because there are structures, there are courses, there are academic posts, there are funding streams, there's inherent bias, so it takes time. The key to changing it will be to get endowed chairs in Ukrainian studies. Endowed chairs, because it's permanent professorships or permanent lectureships that actually change the way things happen in academia. They then have research projects, they have students on particular courses, they have visiting fellows, the whole thing. So that, if there's one thing that I hope comes out of this whole explosion of interest in Ukraine, it's permanent posts. Because otherwise the danger is you have this evanescence of interest. Every publisher does one or two Ukrainian books. Every film society does one or two Ukrainian films. There are great events. And then after 5 years, it's faded away.
It's very interesting. And do you think that we need to give some kind of specific motivation for students to enroll in these studies if they exist, or the interest is there already?
I think the interest is there, but, if for starters, there's no one to teach you Ukrainian, and I mean, there's just tiny handful of people at British universities. I think there are 2 chairs in Ukrainian studies, a handful of places where you can learn Ukrainian, and if the courses are not on offer, they're not going to come. So I think, so to speak, if you get the supply side right, I think the demand will be there.
Okay, that's very interesting because we're, part of this project is also kind of to understand academia better and maybe understand what to offer as Ukrainians to it, what we can contribute.
I totally understand. And I've experienced this multiple times when visiting Ukraine in the last couple of years why people reject everything Russian, all things Russian. I was in Kharkiv 4 weeks ago visiting the printing house where my book Homelands was published in Ukrainian by Vivat. And the printing house had been bombed by the Russians, 7 people killed, 21 people wounded. And I talked to actually one of the people who'd been wounded, and she said in Russian, I want Russia to be wiped from the face of the earth, no more Russia, no more Putin. I totally understand that. I understand renaming Pushkin Street and all of that. But if I may, my advice to you is to concentrate on the positive case for Ukraine, Ukrainian history, Ukrainian culture, Ukraine politically, to tell that story, to get people interested in Ukrainian writers, rather than banging on too much about how awful Pushkin and Tolstoy as well as Dostoevsky are. You may be right, you may be wrong, but, you're not going to command so much sympathy in the West in that, and what's needed is making the positive case for Ukraine rather than telling everybody all the time how awful everything Russian is.
Kind of agree with you, because this kind of reaction is not sustainable, and you cannot build like long-term presence. You cannot build studies by just opposing something. So I think this is what we with Ukrainer is trying to do for many years, is to kind of build the value for Ukraine in the eyes of Ukrainians and people abroad somehow, So I think it's a very, very interesting point.
I think it's exactly right. I mean, to be clear, I think it's because I know decolonization is one of your themes. I think it's really important also to understand that at heart and in essence, this is a neo-colonial war, and that Ukraine's experience was an experience of colonialism. So that's really that historical is understanding and to explain. So, for example, in Kharkiv, Pushkin Street was called German Street until 1899, and then it was renamed, to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Pushkin's birth, and it was an imperial naming as much as, having Victoria Street in Australia or New Zealand or some African cities. So I think it's important for people to understand that, but then to make the positive case.
Yeah, because kind of the colonization we go through internally in Ukraine is one thing, but there is like a big external conversation, and it's different. And I think, that's why, it's great to speak to you and other experts from from other countries and other experiences.
Yeah. By the way, I think on the colonial and decolonization narrative, your biggest problem is no longer in the West. I think a lot of people in the West understand that now in a way they didn't before the 2022. But there's a huge problem in the rest of the world. I mean, try to explain to Indians that this is actually a neo-colonial war. Colonialism is something that is done by the West, and particularly by Europeans, specifically by white Europeans, to them, and for whom, nonetheless, in many respects, however rightly or wrongly, they saw the Soviet Union and Russia as some sort of at least to some extent, ally in their anti-colonial struggle. To get across to them that that is what this is about is a much more difficult task. And the last person who can do that is a Brit, right? Or someone French, because we were actually the colonial powers. But I think you as Ukrainians or, Slovenes or Slovaks, who were the objects of colonialism by other Europeans, have a better chance.
And I think this is one of the strategies Ukraine also considering, is to address the rest of the world somehow more, because we have actually things in common that can be explained and can be addressed. You recently published an article in the Financial Times, only NATO can secure a West German future for Ukraine. And I think I always find very interesting, having this historical context and explaining some of the modern issues. Can you maybe elaborate on the idea you put in this article and why the war is basically essential to the colonization process as well?
So the words West German were in quotes in that headline deliberately. But this is something that's very much talked about. What I wanted to say was all historical comparisons are useful for the similarities they reveal, but also the differences. And the differences here are huge. Germany was divided because Germany started the war, Nazi Germany. If Ukraine is going to be divided territorially, at least for some foreseeable future, it'll be because Russia started the war. Nazi war criminals ended up being tried in Nuremberg. Unfortunately, it's very unlikely that Putin and his henchmen will be tried anytime soon. So there's a huge difference in the historical starting point. And my fear is that people in the West are going to use this West German analogy as a kind of fig leaf for retreat, for not giving sufficient support to ensure an independent, democratic Ukraine a viable future. And what has become absolutely clear to me is that what is needed for that is not just EU, but also NATO or NATO strength security, right? Without that kind of security, you're not going to get the scale of foreign investment you need for reconstruction. Without that level of security, you're not going to get millions of Ukrainians coming back to make their lives and help rebuild the country. Without that security, I think a lot of Ukrainians will feel that Ukraine has not won this war, has not come out of it as a victor. And I think you'll have a very bitter politics of recrimination in Ukraine itself. So what I'm trying to do is to put the West, starting with the United States, and by the way, followed by Germany, France, and Britain, on the spot and say, if this analogy with West Germany, which of course then had a very good future, is not to be a bad joke, this is what you need to do, NATO as well as EU.
There is a lot of speculation surrounding what is peace. You were explaining in your article also about the security and giving these examples of world wars. Maybe from the historical point of view, can you explain what actually peace is and what it should be for it to be something lasting, something sustainable?
Well, I think there's a wonderful poem by a Polish poet who says, there are all these different competing definitions of freedom. Some say it's this, some say it's that. But every day, he says, I know what an absence of freedom is. So I'll tell you what peace is not. Peace is not simply the temporary absence of war, of outright hot war, of fighting. And this is the great mistake being made in the whole discussion about getting to quote-unquote peace in Ukraine at the moment. A peace in which Ukraine was not secure, would not last. It would just be a temporary pause in the fighting, and Putin would regroup, rearm, and then have another go. And so peace is definitely more than just the absence of war. It's a stable state in which countries live side by side in security and with a clear prospect that that security will endure. That's what we mean properly by peace. And to get there, sometimes once deterrence has broken down, once appeasement has failed, and that is the case here, the first thing you have to do is to win the war.
When we talk about different issues, like issues like cultural heritage or deported children or things like these, we also understand that we need to win the war to actually solve all of these issues. Without it, it's impossible to actually just talking, and I think the same goes for like this decolonization of perception of the region as well, because Ukraine needs to stay on its two legs, to be capable to continue.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please support us at buymeacoffee.com/Ukrainier International and follow us on social media in different languages. You can find all the links in the podcast description. And thank you for listening.